Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled that you all could be here, and we are just as interested in what our panelists and moderator has to say today. My name is Abby Kisa. I am the Deputy Director at Circle. Circle is a part of the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. Circle is a national research center on young people's civic education and civic engagement, and we are particularly tasked with understanding the resources, the supports, and the access that young people do and sometimes don't have to be able to participate in democracy in the United States. We are thrilled to be able to share new research today. That research and all of our work on media is supported by the MacArthur Foundation and the Knight Foundation. And our conversation today is really a jumping off point from our Circle Growing Voters release last month to think together about what roles and impact the news media can play on welcoming and informing and engaging young people, a diversity of young people in US democracy and especially elections. So I am going to pass it to two of my amazing colleagues who are going to share a little bit more with you about the Circle Growing Voters framework and about the new research that we're releasing today. After that, you will have the great opportunity to hear from journalists and young people and our amazing moderator, Allegra Kirkland from Teen Vogue, about what they think about this research as well as what they think about the intersections of youth, news, and democracy. And so with that, I am going to pass it over to our Diverse Democracy Fellow at Circle, Madeline McGee, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the Circle Growing Voters Framework.
Thanks very much, Abby. As Abby mentioned, today's event is part of a series of conversations that Circle is holding, jumping off of the release of our Circle Growing Voters framework last month. But before we jump into talking about news media in particular, I want to provide some context for the larger conversation that this is a part of. At Circle and Tisch College, we believe that our communities and our democracy become more just and more equitable when all people, individually and collectively, get involved and take action. Over the last 20 years of researching youth voting, we at Circle have learned that the United States often falls far short of equipping young people with the information and opportunities they need to participate in one of the hallmarks of civic life, voting. Although the youth voting rate has risen in recent years, it's never been above 54%, and that prevents us from having a fully representative democracy. And part of the reason that there are these huge inequities, part of the reason is that there are huge inequities in which youth get opportunities to learn about elections and voting and which don't. And these differences often mirror inequities in race and socioeconomic status and education, which are in turn reflected in voting rates. So it's become clear to us that the current way of bringing people into the electorate is not working, and that we need a new way of thinking about how to prepare young people to vote. We need a framework grounded in research that emphasizes how institutions and communities can provide opportunities for all youth to learn about voting, how we can build systems and structures that enable all youth to take advantage of those opportunities, and how we can create a culture that promotes and values voting. We call this framework Circle Growing Voters, and we see journalists and media makers as having a uniquely essential role to play in this framework, because high quality civic information is critical to democracy. You know, the media exists to give people the information that they need to make decisions and to connect people to the varied perspectives and experiences that make a diverse democracy thrive. More than 8 million young people have become newly eligible to vote in the 2 years since the 2020 election, but they can't meaningfully engage with democracy unless they're supported with the information they need to do so. Now, oftentimes when we think about the relationship between young people and news, we think of them as this elusive audience, or else maybe as an audience to be, like maybe one day they'll be interested, but right now they just aren't. But what our research has found is that young people are already a news audience. More than half of teenagers we surveyed in 2020 said they read or watched local news often or fairly often. And 75% of teens said they had gotten information about the 2020 election from a legacy news source. We also know that young people don't just consume news content, but actually find it actionable in becoming engaged citizens. About half of voting age youth we surveyed in 2020 said local news helped them feel better prepared to vote, with newly eligible voters and youth of color especially likely to find local news helpful. What that means is that there's a huge opportunity here to cultivate both an engaged audience and an engaged electorate. But doing that will take intention and a shift in how we think about young people. And the way we do this is not just by putting information out there and hoping that young people find it, but by transforming the culture and process of journalism itself. And that takes listening to young people, centering their perspectives, giving them opportunities to speak for themselves, and covering politics in a way that's relevant and accessible to a diversity of youth. It also means understanding what their media ecosystem actually looks like. Which youth in your community have access to what information and where? And how can you work with young leaders to design better ways of informing the youth electorate? And finally, it means rethinking many of our assumptions around the relationship between news and civic engagement. And one of the biggest assumptions that we see made is the assumption that just reading or watching the news just naturally leads to civic engagement. But the reality is a lot more complex than that. And in fact, we're really happy to share some brand new research with you that highlights some of the factors in a young person's environment that can affect whether or not the information they receive actually turns into action. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Suzuki, to talk more about those findings.
Thank you so much, Madeline. The research I'm about to share fits with the Circle Growing Voters framework as we examine how the resources available to a young person shapes their civic engagement. We were able to explore how different fields may come together to support youth. From prior research, we know that relationships between media and civic engagement are really strong. Young people who pay attention to the news are more civically active, and online forms of engagement are closely linked to offline actions like attending a protest. However, what we know less about is how engagement with the media translates into these actions. What are the factors within that young person's life that plays a role? What are the links that tie media use to civic engagement? These questions are important to answer in order to challenge the misconception that engaging with media directly causes civic action. Knowing the path from media to civic action can empower us to strengthen that path through changes in our practices and policies. We can also understand what may be potential issues in the link between media and civic engagement. To investigate these questions, we analyzed survey data from the Knight Foundation's 100 Million Project. We had a data set with over 700 young people aged 18 to 24 who answered questions about their media use as well as their civic engagement. In our analyses, we examined as forms of media use, news attention, use of social media for civic purposes, and exposure to news in the family. And we looked at how those three media measures were related to registering to vote, giving money to charitable organizations, and collaborating with others to solve a community problem. As expected, we found positive links between the media use and civic actions. News attention was related to solving problems, registering to vote, and donating. Social media was related to solving problems and donating, and exposure to news in the family was related to making charitable contributions. We then explored whether young people's membership in civic organizations facilitate these links. Do youth's participation in organized community groups play a factor in the media action link? Our analyses show that membership in civic organizations play a role in all of these paths, and often a major role. For example, youth who use social media for civic purposes are 1.2 times more likely to work with others to solve problems in their community. And 41% of this link was through membership in civic organizations. Therefore, membership in civic organization was accounting for a major portion of the association between increased social media use and increased problem solving in the community. As another example, higher news attention makes it 1.3 times more likely that youth register to vote, and a fifth of this link was explained by membership in civic organizations. So what does this all mean? Instead of a direct link between media use and civic engagement, we're seeing that young people's interactions with civic organizations play a significant role. Civic organizations may be the place where young people are able to discuss what they see in the media with peers and mentors in order to make sense of it. Civic organizations may also be the venue where young people are finding out how and where to take action. Our findings are aligned with the Circle Growing Voters framework, which underscores a multi-sector approach to supporting youth civic engagement. This leaves us with important questions like, how can media and civic organizations together support youth civic engagement? What might reciprocal relationships between media and civic organizations look like? And if the path from media to action is through civic organizations, what inequities may be introduced? Back to you, Abby.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been so amazing working with Madeline and Sarah on these analyses. And now I have the pleasure to be able to introduce Allegra Kirkland, Politics Director at Teen Vogue. We at Circle are so appreciative of what Teen Vogue has done to amplify diverse youth voices, and especially to really bring so much more nuance and insight into the relationship and the perspectives that young people have on voting and on elections in general. So I'm going to pass it over to Allegra to keep our conversation going.
Thank you so much, Abby, and thanks to Circle for hosting us for this conversation. I'm joined by 4 wonderful panelists today, who I will introduce briefly now. Rachel Janfaza is an associate writer at CNN Politics based in Washington, D.C., where she focuses on youth political culture and basically everything having to do with elections and young people. Hi, Rachel. We also have Roxanne Patel Shepelavy, who's the executive editor at the Philadelphia Citizen, which is a nonprofit newsroom based in Philly, of course, focused on expanding democratic participation and civic engagement in that city. Welcome, Roxanne. Amanda Viju is the youth media manager at KQED in the San Francisco Bay Area. She develops programs that help empower student voices through media literacy and media making, specifically with broadcast journalism. Hey, Amanda. And last but not least, Irene Franco Rubio is a writer and community advocate who's originally from Phoenix, Arizona, I'm sorry, and is currently finishing up her undergrad degree at the University of Southern California. Hey, Irene.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So yeah, huge thanks to all 4 of you for joining us. The way this is going to work is basically I'm going to ask each of you a question kind of germane to your own interest and experience, and then we'll open it up to the group, and then I think we'll have some time for audience questions at the end. So Rachel, I want to start with you. I know you've spent the last few years on this youth political culture beat, which is a beat that doesn't exist in a lot of newsrooms. So I'm hoping you can explain sort of what it looks like to cover policy and Congress and things that people might think of as slightly like drier topics for young people and still make it engaging and accessible. Like, how do you decide what stories you want to cover?
Definitely. Well, first of all, thank you, Allegra. It's great to be here with all of you. And to your question, first of all, it's exciting to be covering youth political culture and Gen Z in a place that is typically covering older voters, the rest of the American electorate. And I think given the research that we just saw, for anyone who cares about youth participation, it's also necessary to have these voices represented in a place that usually doesn't bring in younger perspectives, or at least didn't until recently, or did it in sort of a one-off spin-off way. So there's no perfect science when it comes to deciding what type of story to cover. And usually I will pitch stories that are across the board, whether it be, you mentioned action that will be going on in Congress. So maybe a bill that's being passed and how it pertains to young people in particular, or taking a story about something that is going on in Congress and bringing it to CNN's TikTok so that we can reach younger audiences there. For example, when there was a lot of buzz about congressional stock trading, we did an explainer that we put on TikTok to try to reach younger audiences with something that they may be interested in. And then, so there's, news of the day where you're kind of taking a look at what's going on in the broader political ecosystem and then thinking about how it may pertain to young people, looking back at the 2020 election when there were really high numbers of voter registration that were happening, record numbers, we covered that then, or when these restrictive voting bills have been passed at the state level across the country, looking at youth-led protests that have been organized in response to that. So kind of looking at both how an issue relates to young people, but then also how young people in their own local communities are responding to either federal or local legislation. And then there's also sort of the more feature stories, like taking a look at the first members of Gen Z to launch campaigns for Congress, or going back again to 2020. You start to hear, where you're looking on social media and you see things that young people are talking about. And one thing that we noticed at the time was that college students who may be voting out of state were having difficulty with absentee voting. And so I did a bit of research, and it turns out that there were a number of stories. For example, these two students who lived in Washington, D.C. at the time had to drive 27 hours to Texas to go cast their ballot in the 2020 election because of absentee voting regulations. So as I said, there's no one process of how you determine what story to cover, but kind of just keeping your eyes and ears open and thinking about the way in which, okay, here's a big issue. Let's think about the ways it can relate to young people.
Love that. There's so much there, Rachel. I feel like Irene can probably jump off of that because you have this interesting perspective as, a community organizer, as a writer, and as a student. So you're kind of at the nexus of all the different worlds we're talking about here. So given that, what are some ways that you think news organizations can better understand youth audiences and also make sure that they're bringing in like a diverse range of perspectives and not just talking to the same like super engaged, president of their local like college Democrats or something, but instead, reaching a broader audience?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And first and foremost, again, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. But yeah, I think this is a question I think about often, actually, just in my own sort of trajectory as now an activist, but formerly really as a student journalist. I studied journalism for a bit and actually got to, part of my role there was working with like the career services team and really going out into local high schools and giving young people the opportunity to understand what a career in journalism could look like, how to do multimedia, how to report, just stuff in their local community, and really giving them the chance to like do it on their own. And I think in a lot of ways that really empowered not only myself, because that was my introduction to journalism too, seeing that I had power in sharing the stories of my own community and not needing, someone to come in and kind of decide that. But in a lot of ways, I think that different journalism schools and newsrooms in general can really utilize that as a way to not only, cater to this new generation of diverse young people, giving them the chance to see, the power of their voice, the power of their story, but then also, as they continue to report and gain that understanding, do op-ed writing and having the opportunity to share their own stories on different publications. Teen Vogue does that. I had the chance to do that with Teen Vogue, actually, was probably my first one. And really after that, I kind of felt empowered in myself and sharing, the issues that meant most to me. And then I think after that, after having the sort of experiences and just young people that I've grown up with, eventually being able to pursue careers as a journalist. And in many ways, we're able to bring the diverse, in a lot of ways, like Latinx, Black, BIPOC sort of voices that wouldn't otherwise be in those spaces. So I think eventually hiring a diverse set of young people while they're still young, right? Not needing a whole long list of experiences, but really giving them the chance to do that early on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like people underestimate how much of an effect it has just to have young people in your newsroom, right? Because they get story ideas like from their peers, from their friends, and it just is a much more organic process than like, an older person like parachuting in to a college campus and trying to find stories that way. So great. Well, the next question is for you, Roxanne. You spent more than 2 decades working as a journalist in Philly. So I'm wondering what about that experience led you to kind of think that this community-oriented, solutions-driven journalism was really what the city was missing and what they needed, what the residents of Philly needed?
Yeah, so journalism is the one industry in America that's singled out in our Constitution, right, as vital for the future of the Republic. But so much of the journalism I was writing and reading failed to serve its audience in a couple of crucial ways, particularly in the place it's needed most, which is in our local communities. So one, reading the paper is often about what's wrong, what needs fixing, who did what, with no talk to what works, who's working to fix the problems, how we could move forward. And two, it left readers like me wondering, what can I do about it, right? So I often read the paper and I end up in tears or sort of shrugging my shoulders and saying like, great, the world is coming apart. What am I supposed to do about it? So in September 2015, we launched the Philadelphia Citizen with the idea of trying a different way to do journalism. So we publish stories that focus on solutions to problems in Philadelphia, which means looking at problems with a clear eye, but presenting ideas, people, organizations from here or elsewhere that are working to solve them. And critically, each of our stories includes a do something button intended to answer that question, what can I do? So with every story, readers can click on basically a sidebar that gives ideas of how to engage with the issue in the story, and other ways that they can make their city better. So whether it's signing a petition or attending a meeting, or picking up the litter on your own block, or in some ways being a better citizen and voting. And that kind of speaks to that point that Madeline made, right? About assuming that just reading the news is enough to get people involved is not an assumption that I think we can afford to make anymore, because we have found that even when people read the news, it doesn't necessarily equate to getting involved. And I think that's because there is this kind of disconnect where you have to do a lot of work to figure out what you as an individual can do to affect any of the issues that you're reading about. And so we try to bridge that gap by giving people those tools. And so that combination is unique, the solutions and calls to action. But over the years, it's proven to be more and more what readers want. So there's multiple studies that found that audience hunger for and gravitate towards solutions in their journalism, and that they're looking for ways to engage in those solutions. And we have found ourselves that more than half of our readers have actually taken action based on those do something buttons, which means it's working, right? We're getting like half of the people who read our stuff to actually take action based on what we're suggesting they can do to sort of get engaged in their communities. And that's the cornerstone of everything we do. And we've tried to make the journalism, it's still about storytelling, it's still about doing the same reporting, it's still about uncovering all the same kinds of issues, but doing it in a way that helps readers to also feel like they're engaged citizens.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it can just get so overwhelming that you just kind of want to tune out or just have no idea where to start, as you said. So I think that's fantastic. And then Amanda, this one is for you. Your work kind of really centers on like my guiding light at Team Vogue, what I always try to keep in mind when we're putting stories together, which is just letting young people speak for themselves and let them drive the conversation rather than trying to like write stories for young people or about young people. So can you talk about some projects you worked on at KQED that really managed to do that successfully, like working in tandem with young people? I know it's like everything you do, but just a few that come to mind that you really liked.
So I lead up the Youth Takeover, which is a week annually where youth take over the airways of KQED. And behind that is embedded a year-long program, not only with public school classrooms, but also with our Direct to Youth Advisory Board. And it is this idea of, in the Direct to Youth Advisory Board, we create a mentorship, a direct mentorship, where the board spends some time cultivating their ability to communicate, share ideas, and then work directly with a mentor to produce pieces for airing annually. And the same with our classrooms. So the classroom programs are a deeper reach. It takes anywhere between 3 and 9 months to cultivate production with young people. We go directly into their classroom, we bring producers into the classroom, and we develop the work together. But one of the things that I think is crucial about this work, in that I consider myself a facilitator of intergenerational discourse. And to do that means to understand that a byproduct of young people's oppression is actually, when you ask a young person, what do you think? You get these big eyes, the deer in the headlights, particularly those students that have been most affected in our society by our systemic oppressive system. And so when we say this sort of like allowing young people to speak for themselves, we're still talking about a particular group of young people who are confident and comfortable enough to share their opinions with folks who are not in their personal community or private circle. And so part of the work that I do at KQED is to create an environment in which journalists and program producers work alongside young people so that they understand that one of the great misunderstandings of our time is that we're existing with 2-3 different generations that approach the relationship between an adult and a young person in a really different way. So, for example, there's one generation that believes that, respect is given to your elder, point blank, period. And then we have young people who are thinking that respect is something that is shared, that is shown and given fluidly, and not just a given. And so there's a real way of talking about and with our mentors and with the people that work with young people, that it requires a different type of approach. A young person is not just a source. We can't behave in an extractive way, forgetting what we think we want from them. There is so much for us to learn from each other, and we don't want to miss that opportunity by not allowing the space and time it takes to build trust. And also being really thoughtful about what it means to cultivate youth voice before we expect that they're just going to share it with us or give it to us. And particularly, that means that it's not always, in my experience as a young person and experience of the lives of young people today, it's not safe to immediately just blindly trust people asking you questions. And so we do need to take the time. And one of the things that I say is that it requires an extra equitable effort on the on the part of the adult, so that the experience of the young person is good, and the experience of the adults are also, it's a shared positive experience, so that we're focusing on that we can all have a great time and gear things, not for our own gain as an adult in a space, but so that young people are leaving there, are experiencing something that is authentically giving space for them to understand, learn, grow, and then share.
Yeah, I think that was such a thoughtful response, and I really like the focus on fostering intergenerational conversations, because I think so often there's just that conversation about like, oh, young people are going to save us, or that kind of thing. But so often when people write for us, or in stories we've run, they say like, no, it really means a lot to me to work in, alongside older people who have more experience than I do, and I can share things with them that they don't know, and vice versa. And just kind of, it shouldn't be pitting generations against each other. It should always be like, forging these connections. So anyway, I think we're going to open it up and turn just to the elections more broadly. Unfortunately, the midterms are just a few months away, so we have to talk about them. And yeah, so first off, I think it's, it works a little different for different outlets, right? Like at Team Vogue, every single thing we do has young people in mind. They're our core audience, but that's not true for, say, CNN or organizations that have broader demographic reach. So for maybe some of those more mainstream organizations, or ones that have some older readers or viewers or listeners, what are ways we can cover elections in ways that make young people want to follow this content, want to engage with it, want to read it? Because I mean, do you think it's like, is it about subject matter, like picking topics that matter and directly affect young people? Is it about like format, or, like Rachel said, doing TikToks that break down, complex subjects like congressional stock trading in a more accessible way? Is it about, as Rachel also said, getting young people as the sources in your stories, so it's not just like talking to experts, talking to lawmakers, but also talking to young people who are affected? I just want to, anyone can start, but Irene or Roxanne?
So I'll start. So I think that I think there's a couple things here. I think that so voter turnout among young people is similar to voter turnout among the larger population, which is to say it's pitiful, right? It's super, super, super low. And young people are actually, at least in Philadelphia, are the fastest growing population of voters. So it's still low, but it is, they're growing pretty better than others. And that's in part for a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of organizations that are working to get young people voting. But I think that a couple of things are critical. I think that with everybody, they need to understand why it matters. And this gets back to the idea of journalism serving a purpose of telling people why their engagement in their cities matter. So I think that young people, like anybody who doesn't really engage, often do it because they don't think that it matters. And that part of what we need to do is be explaining why it matters, right? Why does it matter that young people vote? Because there's issues with schools, there's whatever the issues are. if they vote, then their voice is heard, and it is a way of making direct change. So I think that's part of it. And then we address it a little bit too by we try to fill in some of the gaps. And so it doesn't become about the horse race, which is what a lot of you get a lot of, and it becomes about trying to use the election as a way of talking about issues in the city, and then introducing them to the people who are running by showing them sort of like how those people are solving those problems, and not through just their own words, but trying to make them problem solvers, I guess, trying to make the young people problem solvers and joining us all in this sort of movement to better Philadelphia.
Jumping off what Roxanne said about bringing people into the conversation so that they can feel that they're involved. I've been traveling, doing primary coverage that is not necessarily youth focused, but just sort of more general 2022 coverage. And one of the things that I've noticed is that you'll either be, at a shopping center the day before primary election day, or nearby a polling location, not directly at the polls themselves. And there will be all these older people who you ask, okay, are you going to vote? And they're yes. And then you go to a younger person, you say, are you going to vote? And they're like, what are you talking about? They don't know that there's an election, or they don't know. They say, I want to register to vote. I want to vote, but I don't know how. So not only is it, saying why an election matters and why the election can affect a young person, but it's also, I think, about, and this is something that Circle does so well, but providing the resources so that young people actually know how to vote. And I think that's, the whole mission behind the Growing Voters. It's like you have to pair the media coverage with also the resources so that young people can actually know how to vote, because it's one thing to cover the in and outs of the actual election, but then another for that to actually reach the first time 18-year-old voter who might really want to participate but doesn't know where to start. So I think that's something for all of us to think about.
Yeah, just to add to that point on where young people are starting. I think in a lot of ways, young people are more likely now to join a civic org than they are to go to journalism school or to be a journalist. At least in my experience, that's the first step you take in understanding, to your point, Rachel, how do I get registered to vote? Well, let me join an org that can help tell me how. And I think in a lot of ways, going back to what Amanda mentioned on young people who often just aren't equipped or don't have the confidence or the power to speak up early on are now seeing that in community org spaces. And I think journalists can start to, and in many ways already are, go into these spaces, whether it's a protest or just orgs that are organizing year round, not only right now when the midterms are happening, and getting young people's insights and quotes and perspectives as sources, but also just building that relationship. I think in a lot of ways there are journalists, at least in Arizona, that I've seen that go to these events regularly, who already know the orgs, who are leading the work. So it's kind of building long-term relationships, and with young people in particular, helping them see that, them as sources is legit and that they are valid. And in many ways helping them expand as activists, but also as media professionals as they move forward.
Yeah, the Circle report talks about avoiding that transactional relationship in terms of campaigns and organizations, just again, kind of zooming in and being young people register, get involved, and then ignoring them till the next election rolls around, which is just not a real way of building trust or, enduring ties. So I'm wondering, this one, Rachel, probably is most germane for you, but what are you hearing young people are particularly fired up around going into this election cycle? What are they most angry about, excited about, all the things?
I mean, the topic of, I think, all the midterm coverage that we're hearing on the mainstream channels, but inflation and the economy across parties, that's something that I've been hearing nonstop. But I think, of course, recently with abortion, I think that a lot of times abortion is considered separate from that economic conversation, but it really is an economic issue. And so that's something that I've been hearing voters express too. And then recently, I've also been hearing voters, even when I was covering a Republican primary in Virginia, there was talk about gun violence and the way that guns are seeping into communities across the country. So I would say it's economic, abortion, and guns. And I think that a lot of times we think about, or there's conversation about, okay, how does this issue affect young people? But I think that, and sometimes you might think, oh, the economic issues, that's something that only older people have to think about, but that's not the case. And young people are really talking about that all the time. And I remember even like months ago, I was writing a story about young Republicans who were really excited to vote in 2022. And there was a young Republican who was the head of the College Republicans chapter at University of Austin in Texas. And he said, or University of Texas at Austin, and he said that he couldn't even afford to drive. I guess their campus is sprawling and they drive to class, and he couldn't afford to pay for the gas to drive. So it is affecting young people in their day-to-day lives just in the same way it affects older people as well.
Absolutely. And then another kind of trope that comes up every election cycle is this idea of the youth vote, and kind of treating all young people as a monolith that all agree on everything, which we all know is not the case. Gen Z is the most first generation, and people are coming to politics from all sorts of different perspectives and backgrounds and socioeconomic perspectives and all the things we've kind of been discussing today. So Amanda, what does it look like? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I know your work has a lot to do with this, but to cover elections in like a culturally responsive way that's actually like representing this vast range of experience.
Yeah, so, what comes to mind for me with this question is the many years I spent inside a public school classroom and understanding that there is those who, even when given the information, choose not to vote. Majority, the young people like myself as a raised poor brown woman who doesn't believe in the system. Our democracy is in question. The trust is not built. To hope is a dangerous thing sometimes, right? It can seem as too great a cost to those of us who've been greatly affected by a system that, in many ways, hasn't served us. And I think that is something we cannot ignore. We can't pretend like we, regardless of age, have access to the realities of the system. And to build the relationship to voting is to build a relationship to trust, is to build a relationship to, where do you live in this country and how do you see it? How does these decisions affect you? And do you believe that your collective power you can be an agent of change? Now, I, of course, believe that. I believe every single one of us has the right to live and love and be who we are. And it's sharing that acknowledgement with our young people. It's being able to have a culturally responsive way of engaging that begins with listening, that begins with really hearing about people's experiences. And that means hearing their doubt. That means hearing their anger. That means understanding their confusion. We live in a society that is very confusing, in times that are even more confusing. And so we do have to make space for the whole person when we approach conversations around voting, because we're talking about much more to a young person than just, do you have this information? And I think that in the effort and the urgency that we all feel often, it's hard for us to take a pause and make the space to build those deeper connections around what we're talking about, the bigger picture, and how we can all collectively be a voice and where there's meaning in that. So when I think about culturally responsive approach, it always starts with listening. It always starts about taking a moment to take notice of, who are you talking to? Who am I in this conversation? And where can I make the connection that's going to have an impact that can spark an opportunity that then turns into action, that then turns into the belief, that then creates an opportunity to share that experience with another person, and that person is of any age. It could be their grandmother, it could be their sibling, it could be their classmate. And so I'll just pause there.
Yeah, I think some of the angriest kind of responses to coverage we've ever gotten were when we run stories when people question the point of voting. And of course, everyone on this call believes it's incredibly important and does have an effect, but it's also incredibly understandable why some people don't think their vote matters and have been systemically like shut out from access and still are, like so many communities, and just, yeah. So I think making space for that, taking it seriously and not just yelling at people to vote all the time is probably a better approach. So, does anyone else want to jump in on that, or we can move on to audience questions too?
I'll just add something really quick, just because it sparked kind of a lot for me. I really appreciate your insight, Amanda. I think in a lot of ways, for the longest time, I didn't know the power of voting. I think you're describing the young person that is like myself, that grew up in this low income area, daughter of immigrants, that sort of thing, and them not believing in the power of voting and influenced me to think that it didn't work either. And I think that was what eventually made me question, like, why is their life impacted by systems of oppression? And eventually I fell into organizing spaces and was like, oh wait, it does actually matter. We've been misinformed. Forget it, guys. Like, don't worry. Let's, and in that way, really empowering my community to see the truth in a way of where I understood and where they were coming from and how I could inform that. But yeah, I just wanted to add that I think that's super valuable. And I think that's something that most journalistic spaces, or at least what I read when it comes to midterms, forget to talk about. Because at the end of the day, it's the groups that are being directly impacted. Young people of color in low-income areas have a much, starkly different version of the reality that a wealthy white young person in a rich neighborhood does. And I think that's worth addressing.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, because Irene, you spoke so eloquently. Part of what I love that you're pointing out about is the active healing that needs to take place for democracy and in our society, and the places in which all of us, where we are in news. Roxanne, you shared about solutions, right? Like how that does need to come into play at equal level of the act of voting itself.
Okay, lovely. Well, we do have a couple of questions ready from the audience. This is a bit of a 180 from what we've been talking about, but I think it's worth chatting about the ways newsrooms can help youth in their coverage areas with identifying misinformation around elections online. Does anyone have any suggestions on this one? You mentioned TikTok, obviously, like, can be a really bad fountain of terrible misinformation. So.
KQED actually does a lot of work in this area around media literacy and creating free curriculum and certificate programs for educators to learn how to teach and share how to identify misinformation. So that's a national public resource. It's available to anybody. But part of what is here is a sort of a gap in media literacy when it comes to identifying misinformation and being able to clearly understand the signs of what it is. And so, oh, sorry, I got distracted by the chat there. So yeah, so that's a source if anybody is interested in being able to get there, because we often partner with educators in order to support, and there are ways of teaching that on a wider thing as well. But it's something that I haven't heard a lot of folks mention. So thank you for that questioner.
Okay, so another one is about, I think you did give us some good examples, Amanda, but about the person wants to know, how can media do that work that you're talking about of building trust? I guess if you want to add anything beyond what you
I do want to add something to it, that there is a fundamental sort of calendar difference and like that I want to acknowledge here. So first, it's to acknowledge the fact that the news runs at a pace that is not in line with the pace of a young person's life. And so acknowledging that sort of, I call them totally different like worlds, that building a bridge to be able to understand that the pace at which the news has an expectation for their information is at odds with the pace of a young person's life is one thing. I organize and create and facilitate that work for KQED. But the first step, at minimum, which we often share with folks, is to create a youth advisory board. And that is to invite young people to the conversation, to balance the conversation. Sometimes that can be an experience that's facilitated pretty extractively. Tell us what you think about this and tell us what you think about that. And that's it. And what I want to encourage people to do is, when you engage in developing a youth board or a group of young people that you want, maybe a focus group, right? You definitely want to be able to give back in that experience. So, and that doesn't mean sweet swag. It means an opportunity, much like Irene was talking to. What is the give and take? What is the shared experience? What can be a product everybody can be proud of afterwards? So I want to encourage everybody, if you are interested in working with young people, start with asking young people what's going to work for them, and then really listening before taking any big leaps, and keeping that feedback loop open. Oh, is this what you meant? Is that what you meant? And being able to really incorporate that, and then see this feedback was incorporated in this piece, and publicly acknowledging that. That's huge. It builds trust, and it makes space for the intellectual labor to be acknowledged.
I could provide an example of what Amanda's mentioning. So when I was a senior in high school, and it was super random, it was like the middle of summer, I came across it was like an NPR affiliate like youth program called Spot 127, and it was like on the west side of Phoenix, really random. I had seen the building, never once thought. And I went for the summer, and it was this free program, and it was like my first introduction to journalism, to news media, and engaging with journalists. Like every day they were just there, they would work from there, and we would also learn how to do podcasts and like just writing in general. And I think in that way, just having this sort of framework of what a journalist does, and then at the end of the night, going home with my parents and watching the local news and understanding that whole breakdown of things, really gave me the insight of like, this is credible, like these people know, do care about the communities that they're covering. And in that regard, as I got older, really seeing that I too could be part of that conversation. So I think, to your point, Amanda, it's just like building that trust early on and investing in young people at a time when it may seem like we don't have a lot of insight or we didn't know much, but it pays off as you get older. So really starting in low income areas and in communities where, these folks are being covered on a day-to-day basis, but were never once asked. So having the space to talk about those things is really helpful.
I think I would also just add that hiring young people and letting young people be the ones who are doing the reporting really will help to build trust with younger audiences as well. And when I'm talking to sources all the time, or to people in communities, or even when I'm on the ground and they see like I'm their age, I think it might make, I don't know this to be certain, but it might make them more willing to talk to me too, because I'm not some older person being like, okay, so what do young people think? But, I'm 24 and able to just talk with other 24-year-olds, even 21-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, etc. So that is just something that I think has been beneficial in cultivating the relationships I have with the people who have given me ideas for stories, is just that they see that I'm just like them.
We only have time for one more question, but one thing I've been thinking about a lot, this is inspired by something in the chat, a bit of a twist on it, is just this idea of how we motivate young people to get involved in politics, to think their vote can make a difference, or not voting, or just any sort of involvement in their communities, anything that like feels personally meaningful to them, while also really recognizing that sort of kind of, just looking at the world around us and being like, it's understandable that you feel disheartened and worn out and frustrated with local or federal leaders, state leaders, just sort of like navigating that as members of the media in a way that's like respectful, but not contributing to that sort of sense of disillusionment. I know Roxanne was going to say solutions and providing,
Well, what I was going to actually say was, because I see that in the questions, people are also asking about schools. So in Philadelphia, there was a great movement started really by a high school history teacher to get all of the schools, all the high schools in Philadelphia to register 18-year-olds to vote. So when they're seniors, right, a bunch of them turn 18 every year. And so catching this revolving group of people, but it's not just about registering them to vote, right? Because that's not enough. It's about all of the civic education that goes around it. And the way he did that was by recruiting young people within the schools. And now it's become a statewide thing called PA Youth Vote. And then there's a couple of these organizations, another one called Vote John, which is a Philly thing. And what they've done is it's young people who are invested in the idea of voting and are talking to their peers about voting. And what we do as journalists is, like, I'm an advisor on Vote John, and I help them figure out how to get the word out, right? We will publish some of the things that they're putting out there because we're really invested in this idea of voting. But a lot of it is driven by these young people with adults of these various different, there's some civic organizations involved, there's a professor at Penn involved, there's this teacher, there's journalists, just helping to sort of guide them as they do this. But I think, to Rachel's point, it is young people talking to other young people about the importance of doing this. And I think our role as journalists can be to elevate that work, right? To sort of make sure that they're hearing from sources who they trust about these issues. I'm sorry, and actually the young people, this group actually lobbied the school district to make it a policy that now in every single high school this is just this year, every single high school in the city, they will actually send out voter information and do some programming around it. So it's like a thing that has now taken on it's powered.
Wonderful. Well, if anyone has closing thoughts, you're welcome to jump in. If not, thank you so much to all four of you for your really insightful comments. Yeah, this was wonderful. Thanks to Abby and everyone else at Circle for having us.
Thank you.
I did have one closing thought, if that's okay. Often, because I spent many years inside the public education system with teachers and cultivating sort of a social justice pedagogical practice, part of what I can see is around the questions is really wanting to know how. And I want to encourage everybody in this space, if you're asking how, whoever you are, however you are, that is the start of finding an answer for yourself, and try things. Try it out. Learn from a process that you start yourself. Learn from a process that you modeled off somebody else. Learn from a process that maybe you go through with yourself. And so I think that that's how we can all affect change, and inspiring one another to continue to hope, to live, and to thrive, and to help heal what can sometimes feel like a broken system.
Thank you so much, Allegra, Rachel, Roxanne, Amanda, and Irene. Thank you all so much for being here today, for contributing your wisdom and your challenges for the group. Again, my name is Abby Keese. I'm Deputy Director at Circle, and I think this is just the very beginning of a conversation. Circle released some new research today. We're going to release even more over the course of the next year with our great funding partners at MacArthur and the Knight Foundation. Special thanks to Allegra for being such a great thought partner on all of this, and for Teen Vogue for their work, and KQED for all the amazing education work that y'all are doing. Please check out those resources. I do want to specifically mention that along with the Circle Growing Voters report, there are summaries with recommendations for a range of stakeholder groups, including media, including teachers. It does mention a lot about media literacy education and links to resources there too. And thank you all for being a part of this conversation. We would love to continue this conversation with you, so please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach us at circle@tufts.edu, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you to my colleagues Alberto and Madeline for putting all this together, and to Sarah Suzuki for her brilliant intellectual prowess and helping us with the research today. And thank you all for doing the work of strengthening democracy. We look forward to talking to all of you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.